So, as you've probably decided, at this point you want to make video games or film. You love making characters and you want to make a living out of it. Well, as you may have noticed, getting a job in this industry isn't for the faint of heart. It's going to be a lot of applications, but that's unfortunately part of the nature of the industry. If you can look past those things, it's a career that I can say personally I would choose time and time again. The first and most important thing that you've got to tackle to get a job is going to be making your portfolio. I know that I and countless others have talked about this topic, but if you want to work in games, you have to make characters that can match the quality of work of the people that you're trying to work with. So, in your eyes, you've hit that mark. Now what? Well, you've spent months or maybe even years building your portfolio, and it's time to send it off in hopes to potentially get your first job. Now, one question I always get is how can you find jobs? Well, there's a couple of places that I personally like to look for these opportunities. The first place that I always check is I look at the listings on somewhere like LinkedIn. In my experience, LinkedIn is the number one place I always have found opportunities and what studios are hiring. Another option that you may have is sites like ArtStation job boards. Here's going to be a main source to find what studios are hiring. I will note that they don't always have every opportunity posted here, but it is a nice second option to just see what else might be potentially out there. Now, the last method is going to be the hardest, but that is just the manual labor and brute force method. And this, I usually go to each individual studio that I may potentially be interested in, and I check their job posting. This is obviously going to be the most time consuming, but in the past, I have gone to websites like Valve and seen that they're hiring for a character artist role, but they don't post and advertise to fill that spot on things like LinkedIn. It's kind of you just stumble upon it. One last thing that I have noticed when looking for opportunities is sometimes in situations a studio may be hiring on something like LinkedIn, but they don't necessarily do a great job of broadcasting the opportunity, so it doesn't get the most visibility. So you do have to do a little bit of digging to ensure that you can find all of the available opportunities that are out there. So after some research, hopefully you found some roles that interest you. Now it's time to start applying for those roles. Like any job you apply for, you're going to see a list of requirements that the application requests. Those things usually are going to be your resume, your cover letter, your portfolio, and a handful of potentially other miscellaneous items. Now, at this point, you might be thinking to yourself, oh, well, all I've ever heard is that the portfolio is the most important thing, so if that's the case, all this other stuff doesn't matter. Well, that is 100% wrong. This is actually going to be the first test to actually getting yourself somewhere in this process. The person who's going to be looking at your application is a recruiter, and that recruiter cares about you following the rules of the application. If you don't submit stuff correctly, two things are going to happen. Your info is going to be sent to a system that can parse through your information and see that you don't have the correct information on the application requirements, and it's going to put you in a bin for we don't want to follow through with this person. Or a person may review your information and see that you can't follow guidelines or rules and think, if this person can't follow a couple of simple steps for an application, how are they possibly going to work in a game studio? So make sure that you don't skimp out on following all the processes for submitting your application. You don't want to shoot yourself out the gate, so do your due diligence and make sure to fill out the application properly. One last thing that I did want to note with the application requirements is they always come up with the years of experience on your application. Now, this detail can be somewhat loose and open to interpretation. A lot of the reasons for this is because it's meant to deter people that have no business applying for this position. For example, some random Joe off the street that thinks, hey, making games for a profession, that sounds pretty cool, I'm gonna go ahead and apply. With that said, it's also worth knowing that experience can mean a lot of things. It can mean attending a four-year college that teaches you stuff for game development. It could also mean working on your own games, on your own characters, and understanding the process to create characters for games. This requirement isn't a set lock detail, and this is where your portfolio can prove that you have the experience and the skill to fit this qualification. Okay, and just like that, the application is now off. And that leads us to the waiting game. This is going to be the most stressful part from here out on actually getting the job. Why, you may ask? Well, because everything's gonna just be one big waiting game. First, you're gonna wait for a reply for your application. For this, I've seen a number of time frames on hearing back. You could hear back the next day, you could hear back a month from now, and as much as I would like to tell you not to worry and constantly check your email for a response, I know that you're going to. So just try your best to stay calm, to check it and not get discouraged, because this part of the process can take any number of days. I will say, in my experience, when I least expect it is usually when I end up getting the response back. So you sent off your application and you finally hear something back and they say, hey, underscore dot dot dot, enter your name here, whoever you are, we would love to talk to you about interviewing for this character position. Now, in your mind or in person, you may be jumping up and down because you're super excited and you've been waiting for this opportunity for months, if not years, which is great and is something to be super excited about. And I want to take this opportunity to hopefully try and prepare you for what to expect from this point moving forward. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, okay, well, I got the interview. I just have to pass the interview and then bam, I'm going to get a job. And although, yes, you do have to pass this interview, it doesn't stop here. This is going to be the most intense part of the application process, which is actually going to be broken up into 3 separate parts and interviews. This first part of the interview is going to be an initial screening. This part is going to consist of you talking to a recruiter, and they're usually going to ask you, a range of different questions, kind of checking to make sure that your resume and your qualifications are legit. You'll probably hear questions like, where did you go to school? What was your work experience at the last place that you worked at? What software did you use to make your art? What is your salary expectations? Now, that last question I actually did want to touch on really quick. I will say from personal experience that when I got this question in my first interview, I didn't have a response. I didn't know what to say because I didn't really know what the position was worth or what the value of being a character artist was. So at this point, I told the interview that the salary was negotiable, and that gave me time to wait to give a response to that answer. That question will come up again at some point in the interview, but it'll most likely be at the end of the interview loop when the recruiter is trying to put together an offer package for you. The last thing that I wanted to mention in regards to this is you might be curious, well, how do I figure out what I'm worth for this position? That's a tough one, but from my experience, the best way to go about this is to use sites like LinkedIn or Glassdoor to get an understanding of what the salary ranges for the positions are. Also, so that you can understand the salaries based on the locations where these positions are at. Keep in mind that salaries will vary depending on the location that you're at. If you live in California, you're going to see a very different salary base than you would in somewhere like Texas. This is also the case if you're working in somewhere like Europe or across the rest of the world. Just so you guys can also get another idea, I'm going to go ahead and include a link in the description with a Google Docs that's been assembled with the salaries of different positions throughout the globe and through different years of experience. So hopefully you can get an idea of what salary might be comparable for what you're interviewing for. And with that said, you're now through the first portion of the interview. Hopefully things went well, and at the end of the interview, the recruiter will most likely give you a timeline on when you could expect to hear back about further steps for the interview. Once you have that information, you're going to be back into the waiting game. This waiting game can usually take anywhere from a day to a couple of days to maybe a week to a couple of weeks. It all really just depends on how things are going at the studio. But luckily you heard back that they liked you and wanted to proceed with the interview, so this is going to be how the next steps of the interview process are going to be. This second leg of the interview is usually going to be held with someone like an art director or a character lead, or someone of a higher up position, or maybe a combination of multiple people. The point of this section of the interview is going to be kind of more of a skill check. They're going to most likely have you open up your portfolio, and they're going to have you talk through some of the pieces that you created. During this portion, they're going to try and make sure that you understand the process of creating a character from start to finish. They're going to want to pick your brain on how you approach certain things and how you solve certain problems that may ultimately help them in the process of creating characters for their game. During this part of the interview, some of the questions that you might be able to expect are: what are the tools that you like to use for your character creation? What were some of the technical challenges that you had when making the character, and how did you overcome them? What are some of the things that you would do differently about this character now? Now, these questions may seem pretty straightforward and simple to answer, which they are, and they aren't meant to confuse you, but they're just meant to make sure that you have an understanding of the software in the process. But those usually aren't going to be the only questions that you'll see. You'll probably also receive questions that are a little bit more technical ended in nature as well. Things like, can you talk to me about the topology and how you ensure clean deformation in highly deformable areas? How do you go about ensuring that your character falls in PBR correct values? How do you ensure that those values will work correctly in lighting? If we had such and such problem, how as a person would you tackle that problem? These types of questions are obviously going to be a little bit harder to answer, especially if you've never had any production experience where you've had to do the kind of stuff that's required in production. These may not come up, but if they do, I would just answer these questions to the best of your ability as they come up. And don't be afraid to say things like, oh, well, I don't have experience with that, but make it clear that you're open to learning and willing to try new things. In this section of the interview, if you find that you have a strong portfolio and characters that can convey that you know what you're doing, you should be in a good situation. You just have to make sure to clearly explain how you went about things and discuss some of the process and why you made the decisions that you made. And that is going to wrap up the second part of the interview. And just like that, we're back into the waiting game once more. In my experience, I found that this portion, you're going to see a little bit longer of a wait time because the people who interviewed you are going to have to report back to the recruiter, and the recruiter is going to have to follow up with you to set up a final interview loop. Which at this point, you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, I've talked to the recruiter. I've also talked to directors or leads. Who else could I possibly talk to? Well, that's just the case. You're probably going to be talking to a majority of the team now. In my opinion, this is the most stressful part of the interview because of the fact that you're not just talking to one or two people for half an hour, you'll be talking to multiple people from multiple different departments, things like talking to concept artists, tech artists, game designers. You're really going to run the whole gamut of people that you would interact with on a day-to-day basis in a production. Now, what makes this section of the interview really difficult is you're going to be getting questions outside of your normal comfort zone. During the first portion of the interview, you were asked things like, oh, what was your process for the character you made, or what tools did you use? Things more in that nature, which those questions most likely fell in the realm of things that you're comfortable answering. But with this portion of the interview, you're going to have to prove to other departments that you know what to do in creating a character and making sure that you can help them solve the game issues and challenges that you're going to face for this project. So to give you more of an idea of some of the things that you may be asked, here are a couple of questions that I've been asked in past interviews. If you have a character whose abilities are X, how would you help to convey that information to the player on first glance? How do you reconcile conflicting feedback and direction between two different departments? Have you ever had to set up something like your own VFX? Have you ever worked on blend shapes? I will say that all of the questions that you're probably going to receive at this point are more project related. The team is really trying to ensure that you can be a person that can help solve these problems that their team is going to face and tackle when creating their game. Now, you may be saying to yourself, well, I've never done those things, which is okay. It is okay to not have experience or all of the answers to everything. But again, you should be honest and upfront about that. In those situations, I would say, oh, well, I've never actually done that before, but it's something I want to learn. I had that come up in a previous interview when I was asked about something like blend shapes. It's something that I know how works, but I've never done it in a production situation. I made that clear and apparent, but I made sure to convey that I was ready to learn it and it was something that I knew that I could tackle. So the last thing that I wanted to mention on this portion of the interview is that this section is not only a kind of skill check on your abilities, but it's also a vibe check. What I mean by that is that it's an interview to see how the people like you. Working in games is 95% collaboration, and you want to like the people that you work with. So a large part of what the team is feeling out in this section is whether you would be a good team culture fit or if you'd be someone that they would have a hard time working with and getting along with. That is one of the key takeaways here, is just be a nice person that people want to interact with and get along with. At this section of the interview, I will say that most of the time, the people interviewing you already know that you can do the job. They're more so looking to see if you're someone that they want to spend a large portion of their day interacting with, and that they also just want to double check to make sure that you can do the tasks that they need. Following up the interview with the panel, you'll most likely talk to a recruiter and they'll give you an idea on the timeline on when you should receive an answer. Now, we're ultimately back to the waiting game once more. This, in my experience, can be anywhere from a day to a couple of days to 1 week, 2 weeks, or in a very rare occurrence, 6 months later, they'll tell you you didn't get the job. But that's a story for another day. That did happen. But in reality, you've now finished the entire interview process, and it just becomes the waiting game. Like the process before, this waiting doesn't feel great, but you will receive an answer soon enough. At this point, the recruiter will have met with the panel that interviewed you and come up with a consensus on whether they liked you and want to extend an offer. In your case, hopefully they have, and that will be conveyed to you. And at this point in the process, this usually brings us back to the discussion of payment. Here is where you'll most likely be delivering your expectations for salary. Hopefully at this point you've done some research and looked into the info that I provided to hopefully help you make an educated decision. But when discussing salary, 2 things that I would recommend to you. First being, don't try to undersell yourself. You're already getting an offer, so tell them the amount that you need in order to have a livable wage. I can tell you from my own experience, when I received my first offer, I just threw a number out there, which in all honesty, I didn't really know if it was fair, and they actually came back and offered me above what I wanted because it was under their salary band. Secondly, don't be afraid to ask for what you feel is right. That being said, don't tell them some unrealistic number like I want $1 million. Have a truly realistic number in mind. The worst thing that they can say is no. I've told companies a number before and I've had 2 situations. 1, they agree. 2, they don't agree and they offer me less. They aren't going to retract sending you an offer as long as you're willing to negotiate. And again, as an example, I can tell you that I've had this happen as well. The them telling me no part, not the retracting offer. That part's never happened before. And to this point, you have now gone through the entire interview process. You've talked to different departments, you've gotten a job, you've gotten an offer, and hopefully you're going to be starting soon. So if you found this helpful, which hopefully you did, make sure to leave a comment and like below, and make sure to subscribe to see more stuff about being a 3D character artist. Hopefully you guys found this helpful, and I'll see you guys in the next one.